Thanks for the possibility talking to about my research project. Oh, there's some light. That's great. Which kept me busy during the last years. I focus in that project on Polish and Soviet child forced labor, those deported to Germany or forced to work in German-occupied areas. And at the very beginning, it was my idea to include in that study Jewish child forced laborers as well. But after a while and after some preliminary analysis of data collected, I decided to split the whole project and to publish on Polish and Soviet children first. Now the technique is leaving me. So I published the first book on Deportation und Zwangsarbeit, deportation and forced labor of Polish and Soviet children, child forced laborers last year, and I hope to finish the second volume on Jewish children within the next 2 or 3 years. Let's wait and see what will happen. Polish and it's fine. Polish and Soviet child forced laborers were placed at the bottom of the German racial hierarchy of forced laborers, with Polish. It's absolutely fine. Leave it.
Camera.
I don't bother about the camera. With
that's good.
That's his problem. Sorry, with Polish children a bit better off than Soviet children. My research has focused particularly on 2 areas, in a nutshell, policies and ideologies. These included the question as to what extent German civil and military authorities were involved in both deportation and forced labor, and additionally I was interested in any interdependencies between forced labor, deportation and the so-called Germanization program, in particular in the annexed territories of Poland and in the general government. And the second group of research questions were around memories and testimonies. In this area I was interested in the experience of deportation and forced labor as reflected in testimonies. So you see, I worked with all material available, with archival material, German documents, but also with testimonies. Due to a lack of contemporary German statistics on child forced laborers and post-war statistics on repatriation and resettlement of displaced children, it is not possible to give any exact numbers. However, I've tried to estimate the number, and I think that a very traditional estimation might be that around 1.5 million Polish and Soviet children have been deported to Germany during the Second World War, child defined as a person under the age of 18. In the following I will focus on 2 areas: the experience of deportation, forced labor and liberation, and secondly forced labor as a topic in Jewish and non-Jewish children's testimonies. As a general observation, it is safe to say that the age of forced laborers deported to Germany by German civil and military authorities decreased during the war. The longer the war lasted, the younger the deportees became. Also, there can be no statistical proof. The tendency can be seen, for example, in official documents about age limits, as well as in documents on the registration and mass deportation of age groups, both in occupied Poland and in the occupied areas of the Soviet Union. In 1944, for example, children in the age of 10 were deported by army group centered around Minsk to Germany to work for the Junkers plants in Dessau and Krymica. The deportations took place according to general orders given by Berlin, whereas the translation of these orders into practice were determined by a variety of regional and local factors, among them the competition between the Reich and the occupied areas, as well as the competition between civil authorities and military authorities who had an interest in forced labor as well. Additionally, there were enormous displacements within the Soviet Union caused by military action, by conscription to the Red Army, by Soviet attempts to evacuate industrial capacities and the workforce to the east, and the remaining population in the occupied areas was dominated by women, children, the elderly, and persons unfit for work, and this helps to explain why there is such a high proportion of young and female Ostarbeiter in Germany, those from occupied areas of the Soviet Union. Nearly all deportations were carried out using physical and mental violence, including roundups at schools, marketplaces, churches, cinemas, beaches, Kiev, for example, and by the enforced collaboration of local Polish and Soviet civil administrations. The latter was important, the enforced cooperation, in filling the quotas. It also put enormous pressure onto villages and families who often had to name family members for deportation, and this of course opened the door for corruption and for bribery, for sexual abuse as well. I will now highlight some issues typical of child forced laborers' testimonies. To begin with, it has to be stressed that separation and deportation are central topics in most children's testimonies. Children talk about them in detail. Depending on the context in which the testimonies were produced and the age of the interviewees when deported, there are some more or less detailed information about the family's pre-war years, pre-war life, and how the war changed daily life. Most important for the children, however, were the events around deportation, the roundup, the notification by the labor office, the appearance of policemen and soldiers in the village, and so on. Highly emotional are reports on the act of separation, how the parents reacted, what the children took with them to Germany if they had a chance to do so, or that members of the family accompanied them to the train or even visited them in the transit camps. Soviet children also mention in detail the journey to Germany, which often took more than a week, sometimes 2 weeks, and the length of the transport and the disastrous conditions on the cattle and goods train must be, so I think, the reason why Soviet children remember it so well. And similar stories cannot be found, not so often be found in testimonies of Polish children. The journey was much shorter. Although adult forced laborers often talk about the length and the conditions of the transport, too, there are some typical and gender-related memories in children's testimonies. In particular, girls, former girls, stressed the fact that they could not relieve themselves in the wagons, that they had to wait long hours for the next stop, and finally that they had to do it together with boys and men on a field. Similar are descriptions of delousing procedures which took place both on the way to Germany and again after arriving in Germany, and even after all this time, even after 50 or 60 years, the narratives transmit an idea of the humiliating situation, in particular when the girls had to undress completely in front of men who watched them having a shower and carried out the treatment. There are also detailed reports about their arriving in Germany and the feeling of being sold on a slave or cattle market when employers choose their forced laborers, sometimes in public. Typical of children's testimonies are very emotional remarks about continuous pain of parting, homesickness, and endless tears at night, accompanied by deep concerns about parents, siblings, and other members of the family. Soviet children, to give you another example, talked about their daily humiliation when they were escorted from the camp where they lived to the factory where they had to work. And in this context, Soviet children occasionally compared their situation with the fate of Polish child forced laborers, who after a while were allowed to walk independently from the camp to the factory, or could even take a bus or a tram. Age-specific differences can be spotted when children spoke about their working conditions. Most of them stressed the point that work was much too hard for them and much too exhausting for them, and that they could hardly stay awake during night shift. That's a typical topic, night shifts in children's testimonies, and that they fell asleep or were punished when falling asleep, etc. In this context, it is safe to say that child forced laborers were beaten more often than adults. They were beaten, if you like, twice, because it was usual practice to beat children, and secondly because they were forced laborers, child forced laborers from the East, often simultaneously insulted as Polish or Russian swines, pigs, subhumans. According to many testimonies, such abuse was regarded as most painful when carried out by German children, not only by the adults, but by Hitler Youth or children on the street. If you finally look at how children remembered liberation, some more differences between their testimonies and those of adults become obvious. According to historian Galina Galinchenko, she works in Kharkiv, I think, children recalled their liberation by the Red Army in a cheerful and enthusiastic way. Most of them could not wait to go home. Following official Soviet statistics, 5.2 million Soviet citizens were repatriated in 1944 and 1945, and then another 250,000 between 1946 and 1949. Children who had grown up during forced labor were often integrated into Red Army reserve units, where they rubbed shoulders with a total of 1 million other repatriates. Some even served in the Red Army during the final stages of the war or after the war. So far, little is known about the treatment of children in Soviet filtration camps, and if they had been screened in the same way as adults had been screened in these camps. According to historian Tatiana Pastushenko, in Kiev, children who returned to Ukraine were treated more indulgently than adult returnees. Historians from the former Soviet Union agree that hardly any forced laborers talked openly about his or her experience in Germany until 1990. Forced labor was regarded as a dark spot on the biography. Some remarks about forced labor as a topic in Jewish and non-Jewish children's testimonies. In general, as briefly explained, child forced laborers, Polish and Soviet child forced laborers, talk about their pre-war years, depending on their age, of course, the process of deportation, the experience of forced labor, and then some do, others don't do, liberation, repatriation, and silence under communism. Accounts of Jewish child forced laborers are constructed in a very different way. To quote from Boas Cohn's analysis of testimonies published in Letzten Huben, quote, the testimonies recount different survival stories and different experiences, but three issues stand out: the centrality of family, the encounter with death, and relations with non-Jews. Also, a final and detailed analysis is still lacking, and that's the ice I'm walking on is very, very thin at the moment. Some differences between the testimonies of Jewish and non-Jewish children forced to work are obvious. Most importantly, compared to Polish and Soviet former child forced laborers, most Jewish children do not talk in great detail about their work experience. And I know many of you will oppose that view immediately. But compared to Polish and Soviet children, there is a lack of information about work experience. Occasionally, the accounts contain only a few lines about forced labor in or outside the camps and ghettos. Additionally, and I know there will be opposition in this room, the language is less emotional when talking about forced labor and how the interview is perceived forced labor. Much more less emotional compared to Polish and Soviet children. I do not say that the interviews do not contain emotion. They do. But when they talk about forced labor, it's less emotion. This might have to do with the different grade of traumatization, might be, but also with the context in which accounts had been given. In other words, the context did not always favor detailed telling about forced labor. Interviewers were often not interested in the topic, as historians for many, many decades have not been much interested in Jewish forced labor, apart from some who have done pioneering work. And it seems to me that in these interviews, when the narration about forced labor is so short, children or interviews just regard forced labor as one of the tools to survive.
Yes.
Yes, I worked in the camps. Yeah, in 5 camps I was in construction, full stop, end of story. That I mean, what I mean saying it's comparable or compared to Polish and Soviet children's testimony, it's very, very short and it's less emotional. However, if we, and I think we all agree that forced labor was carried out, was part of the Holocaust, destruction by work, killing by work, I think we can see a gap in testimonies. Surprisingly, Boas talked about that we might have too many testimonies. My view is also we have perhaps too many testimonies. There are gaps in the testimonies because of the context in which testimonies have been constructed that did not favor the situation to talk in detail about forced labor. And that was one of the reasons why, at an early stage, I have decided to split my research project to get a decent stock of information, a basis, a database of information about the perception of work in Jewish children's testimonies. I have to dig much more deeper, and I have to trace much more interviews to find these information. They are available, but it's not as often as in other testimonies. That's one of the reasons. Thank you very much.